to a question for Jerome. And Jerome's first question is, in this moment, should we be pursuing reform or revolution?
All right. How y'all doing out there?
We're doing great.
All right. Given our times, I've said many times that we're in the middle of a great transition, in our economy and in our society. One that can only be measured by transitions that have taken place before. And the main one the last one to take place was from agriculture to industry. And what that transition did was it spurred revolutions. If you look back at the history of revolutions, if you think about revolutions in terms of the overthrow of one class by another and the replacement of that class by another, all of these revolutions have taken place during transitions throughout history. And so if we are indeed in a transition today from an industrial-based society to a more digital robotics form of production, then we are now in a period of revolution, and so if we're in a period of revolution, if this electronic revolution is already starting and spearing ahead for a political and social revolution, what would we be like as activists saying, no, let's reform capitalism? Let's stand in the face of all this history. Of course, if you don't know that history, you can't make that argument. And so the second point I want to make by why we have to be revolutionaries is because we have to pursue understanding of what's happening in our world today. We have to know, why is it that every institution that we have historically relied on is now unreliable? I don't care which institution you look at. Public education, is that system reliable anymore? Healthcare, is that system reliable anymore? All these institutions are a reflection of this transition. And our opportunity for revolution is in this period of time. So as opposed to reform, we must all fight for revolution. Because in the final analysis, like was said previously, capitalism is in its last stages. It's dying, but it's not going to die. It refuses to die. It has the resources to prevent itself from dying. The only way that it can die is if we kill it. That's the only way. And so yes, revolution.
Would somebody else like to respond to that question?
I concur.
All right. I'll move us on to Jerome's second question. As a revolutionary, how do you work for reforms without becoming a mere reformist?
That's a more complicated one. Because all of these fights, all these things that are crumbling before our very eyes, and our fight to try to get them to serve us, like public education and healthcare and all that, is a reform. And all of those institutions, one of the problems with reforms always is that they all carry an element of support for capitalism as a system. So it's very easy to go from fighting against it to saying, oh, wait a minute, maybe we can just adjust that fight a little bit, and take something less, and we'll be all right. So it's difficult to participate in reform struggles without succumbing to all the privileges and all the shit that capitalism lays out there. And I guess the best example of how that can happen, I think, is the electoral arena. I'm from Atlanta, and we've been involved in a number of electoral struggles, particularly early, and gotten some people elected. And what we found from that process was that we had made a huge mistake. If you don't have, we got people elected without having, our organization dedicated to an electoral struggle, meaning, we got them elected and said, all right, you know what to do, go do it. And of course you have sentenced your elected official to death, and not slow death, a very rapid death. And so I think there are a few things that we have to do. First of all, we have to be able to have strategic unity on where we're going. What is our long range understanding of what we have to do? If that is revolution, if that is to aid in the death of capitalism, let's hang on to that and let's develop a political education program that educates all of our constituencies about that, about what we're fighting for in the big picture, And if we can be successful in creating a critical mass of people in our base that understands the long term, that helps us to stay online in our tactical realities of life. So political education, I think, is one of the most critical things that we can do. And I mean consistent. I've been involved in a lot of organizations. One of the hardest things to do is to create consistent political education that deals with the big picture. It's pretty easy to have some political education that deals with your day-to-day tactics, but it's very difficult to be consistent. So I'm not minimizing the task that is, but that's one of the things you have to do. And then the second thing that I wanted to say about that is that if you can have your strategic unity in place and enough people in your base to maintain that strategic unity, then you have room to make some compromises tactically on the reform struggle, and you can always then be able to say to people who will say to you, well, let's just take this lesser thing, even lesser than what we've been fighting for, which might take you off the path of your revolution, take you into the path of reform. If your base is strong enough with an understanding of your strategic view, you can fight those notions off and maintain your strategic unity. And that's how I think you can be a revolutionary and not become a reformist in the reformist battles that we all are involved in, even if you don't know it.
Does anyone else feel a desire to talk about that? How to work with reforms without becoming a reformist?
I agree.
All right, then we're going to take another 5 minutes.
Wait a minute, we have one comment.
Oh,
I would encourage you all to have a conference just on this question. Like seriously, because according to most forces in the U.S. left, or at least a good number of them, what we're doing in Jackson is supposedly, some advanced stage to where most other people are. And if that's your opinion, then you have to really assess that what we're advancing at this point is repeating all the mistakes of the 20th century. Because that is in essence, cutting through the chase, that is in essence what we're doing. Not to say that there's not an ongoing struggle to kind of correct those errors, because there is. But this question of political education that Jerome speaks of, trust me, it's real. Because a large part of our project was based upon a presumption of unity, and not just a presumption of unity like we were just all in some study group for a year or two, but you're talking about 50 years of accumulated struggle, analysis, rethinking a framework, rethinking an experience over and over again in place. And it still made some critical errors, and it's still making some critical errors despite what gains, that I think we have made some gains. I'm not going to discount that. But, there's some serious things regarding how to approach reform when you're in government, that, at least from my vantage point, the stick is bending far more in the realm of reform in terms of our pursuit around electoral politics than it is about being a protagonistic force trying to advance and elevate the levels of contradiction in our society, leading towards a brighter future. Like in that degree, I would argue, and folks, it's always subject to debate, that, you know, look at our example very closely and critically. I think in that regard, and as a whole, and I'm not just talking about Cooperation Jackson, but the whole social movement, we're failing in that regard. And that's not something to like be sad about. I think it's something for us, all of you, hopefully, to learn so that you don't make the same mistakes that we have made and can maybe leapfrog and advance more things than the great things I already heard that some of you guys are talking about doing with the removal of the statues, etc. You know, so it's to share this to advance practice, not to be down on what's happening, but to note the real struggles that are taking place and what can be gained from learning from them.
I think one thing that I try to remind myself when I start talking about revolution, direct action, reform is, and the question of how do we think about reforms without becoming a mere reformist, is also to think about how we do reform without becoming a colonist, without maintaining colonization, we need to, in everything that we do, center indigenous peoples of this land. And that to me doesn't just mean an acknowledgement, but it also means the actual tangible things that we can do to give land back. If you start talking about what decolonization looks like, the conversation we're having in Indigenous Studies is decolonization isn't anything until you give land back. It's not real, you have to be able to do that part of it, and getting there is the really important part. And so when we start to talk about what revolution or reform looks like, we have to remember that we are all existing on stolen land, in places where people are still here, and that it is a very tangible, physical connection that we have to land and space that we maintain. And so I don't think reform can look like anything unless we start with how do we center indigenous peoples in giving the land back to them.